Okay, today we're going to be covering our final topic for Unit 8, the crisis of confidence in the late 1970s. So, as you hopefully remember from the last lecture, things were not going the absolute best for the United States. There was a series of both foreign policy issues, a loss of faith in government, economic slowdowns, and the sense that the Ford administration wasn't necessarily on top of all these things. The issue that I haven't talked about yet that was on the minds of many Americans during this time period was the inflation crisis. Inflation is, of course, a general rising of prices, and in the 1970s, the United States saw rapid inflation. Inflation isn't necessarily bad because inflation generally is generally a byproduct of economic growth. But during this time period, it was happening in a time of an economic slowdown. And so the inflation rate in the mid 70s, as you can see, jumped upwards of 12%, and then in the late 70s got up to 14%. Inflation is, of course, problematic because your dollar is worth less. You can purchase less with your dollar. And therefore, unless wages rise to match inflation, people's what we call real income, which is income adjusted for inflation, goes down. Ford administration tried to target inflation, but the problem is in order to really bring inflation down, you have to shrink the economy. And the economy was already struggling from deindustrialization, white flight, a bunch of the stuff we talked about last time. So, how much are you willing to make the American people suffer economically to get inflation under control? And the Ford administration was, quite frankly, not willing to do enough. They had these fancy slogans, the fancy acronym WIN or Whip Inflation Now, but beyond like showing a graphic of Uncle Sam whipping a guy labeled inflation, the platform didn't really have much behind it. And this was happening for a variety of different reasons. Obviously, the increasing price of oil, massive issue. The United States, in order to deal with this, starts pushing to develop domestic oil reserves. But obviously, opening up oil drilling facilities is not something that can happen overnight, and so we were unable to deal with the crisis. So, as we get to the election of 1976, the Ford administration is not doing great. Gerald Ford doesn't really have the confidence of the nation. He never really had a mandate. He was unfortunately filmed falling down the steps of Air Force One, which led to Saturday Night Live portraying him, and I think I posted this yesterday, as a bumbling fool who's constantly falling down. So not a lot of faith in Gerald Ford. He ends up getting the Republican nomination over a strong challenge from a new conservative Republican named Ronald Reagan of California. But the establishment goes with Ford as they're worried that Reagan is too far to the right and too far sort of outside the mainstream. The Democrats nominated an outsider themselves, the peanut farmer, Jimmy Carter of Georgia. He was, of course, the former governor of Georgia, and he's a nice guy. And man, I don't know. Jimmy Carter might be too honest, if that's possible. Moment that sort of establishes Jimmy Carter's character to me is for some reason Jimmy Carter gave a interview to Playboy magazine where he admitted to quote lusting after other women in his heart who were not his wife, which is the type of question when someone asks you, "Are you attracted to women other than your wife?" The answer should be no, probably. And most people understand, yes, that's a lie, but it's a lie that we tell you know, in order to smooth social relations. And Jimmy Carter is just not that kind of guy. The election itself, again, uninspiring. I'll give you a second to look over this here, but you see, we've got a faithless elector out in Oregon. Oh, sorry, out in Washington. The popular vote, pretty close, and the electoral vote, pretty close. So we get Jimmy Carter of Georgia as president of the United States, and he's fine. He's fine. He looks kind of scared in this picture to me, but he's a nice guy. Unfortunately for Carter, his years in the White House are often known as the malaise, sort of the vague sense that things are not going well and no one has a sense of how to economically, socially, politically, foreign policy wise turn the country around. We had all these sort of endemic issues of the American economy, and the Carter administration didn't really have a sense of what to do beyond telling people to sort of buckle down and push through it. And I put the document, the crisis of confidence speech, sort of sums up the the American the American feeling, this the sense of ourselves in the 1970s. There was also this idea that, again, that Jimmy Carter didn't have solutions, which, I mean, he didn't, because, I mean, what's the solution to the fact that oil prices are incredibly high and our economy is stagnating? Jimmy Carter's solution was to wear a sweater and keep the heat really low in the White House to save on his own heating bills. And he encouraged other people to do that as well. Which, I mean, yeah, good advice, but like, seriously? I mean, oil is too heating, it's too expensive to heat our house. Your suggestion is put on a sweater and turn down the thermostat. We also had a 55 mile per hour national speed limit, which, if that feels incredibly low to you, yeah, it felt incredibly low to people there then as well. I love the slogan, "A law we can live with." The speed limit was, of course, massively unpopular, routinely violated, very unevenly enforced. It was a hot mess. So, national speed limit of 55 miles per hour, and very ineffective, or not particularly effective at conserving fuel. So we enter into a period that's known as stagflation, which is a combination of inflation and economic stagnation, which is really problematic. Increasing production costs and the inputs led to increased difficulty producing things. So our GDP falls, which leads to increased unemployment, decreased corporate earnings. But the fact that things are getting more expensive to produce is also creating inflation. These things are not supposed to happen together. You usually don't see, and this is too inside economics, but what we were seeing was a significant decrease in something called aggregate supply, which I'm not going to get into here, but take my economics class if you're interested in learning more about it. But what shocked people at this time was we had believed, or traditional economics had believed, in this thing called the Phillips curve. The idea that there was an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. If unemployment was high, then inflation would be low because the economy wasn't growing fast. And if inflation was high, unemployment would be low because the economy was growing quickly. But our inflation and unemployment were somewhere out here, breaking the Phillips curve and basically miring us in a situation where we had to either deal with massive inflation to try to speed up a sluggish economy, or slow down an already sluggish economy in order to get inflation under control. And so, how do you do those two things at once? You know what? You don't. And no one really had the political will to deal with it at this. Jimmy Carter, this should probably be under foreign policy, but he gives the Panama Canal back to Panama. So, and they were super grateful. Look how happy Panama is here. Ah, Jimmy Carter is such a nice guy. So we give back the Panama Canal, which of course outraged American nationalists who, argue that it's an important asset and helps us economically, et cetera. But, I mean, should we really be holding sovereign territory in Panama? You know, the ERA dies under Jimmy Carter, finally. I mean, it had been ratified by both houses of Congress, but as we noted, the movement started petering out in the mid 70s as people started getting more concerned about economic crises and things like that. Plus, there was a concerted movement by a lady named Phyllis Schlafly, or I should probably look at the pronunciation, but she argued strongly against the Equal Rights Amendment because she argued that it would destroy a lot of the hard-won protections that American women had won. The right to, in general, get alimony payments, the right to get custody of children after divorce, and the right, of course, to not serve in the army. Whereas the Equal Rights Amendment would sort of eliminate all of those special protections for women. So she fought hard against the ERA and against feminism in general. And the campaign was successful. The ERA was not ratified by enough states, and so it died its final death in the 1970s. As far as foreign policy goes, Jimmy Carter is kind of a mixed bag as well. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979. We don't. I'll maybe post a document about this, but it's a complicated thing where like they orchestrate a coup, and then the new leaders of Afghanistan invite in quote unquote the Soviet Union, and then Moscow invades and occupies Afghanistan, which, if you've studied history at all, you know is a terrible idea because it's a really incredibly mountainous, fiercely independent, tribally controlled area. And so the Soviets struggled to control Afghanistan, which, shocker. And we funneled tons of money into the Mujahideen, the groups that were fighting against the Soviet Union, because, of course, we want to stop the Soviets. So On the one hand, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was problematic for America for two reasons. First, obviously, the Soviets expanding their territory is bad for us vis-a-vis the Cold War, but flooding Afghanistan with weapons, specifically to rural militants, is somewhat problematic because a lot of these guys are going to become part of the Taliban once the Soviet Union leaves. So, yeah, flooding an unstable region with weapons, probably not the best idea long term, especially if you later plan to invade that area in 15 years and then you've got heavily armed, well organized militias that are, causing problems. As far as victories for Jimmy Carter, the Camp David Accords was a huge victory because it was between he negotiated a treaty between Israel and Egypt. So Israel, of course, is one of the most prominent Arab nations of the Middle East, and Israel is, of course, the Jewish state created after the Second World War. Uh, Israel had not been recognized by any of the Arab countries, and as long as or sorry, as recently as '73, they had been at war with Egypt. So negotiating a peace treaty between these groups was incredibly important, and this was the first time that an Arab nation recognized the right of Israel to exist. So here they are standing, listening to national anthems. Here they are having a very awkward three-way handshake. So the Camp David Accords, amazing accomplishment for Jimmy Carter, except the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, goes home after this and is almost immediately assassinated. So yeah, hardline Arab nationalists assassinate Sadat, and no other Middle Eastern countries have been willing to sign any sort of accord with Israel since. So victory. Ugh. And then there's the Iranian hostage crisis, which man really destroyed Carter's credibility. You may remember that we've been sort of meddling in Persia since the 1950s with the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh. So this coup it starts with a liberal student coup to overthrow the Shah of Iran, but it's eventually co-opted by hardline Muslim elements, the Ayatollahs, and specifically this guy, the Ayatollah Khomeini. As part of this whole deal, they overthrow the Shah. They establish the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is a republic with a legislature and all this. But the Shah is the Ayatollah is the supreme leader, and he has absolute veto power. And the United States resistance to this led to people storming the U.S. embassy, burning American flags, and taking a bunch of American hostages. So, a number of American hostages are held by the Islamic Republic of Iran, and we enter into these negotiations to try to get the hostages back. The Iranians are demanding that the Shah be returned to them. He had been moved to the United States to undergo treatment for cancer, and we refused to turn him over to be executed because we felt like it would, set a bad precedent to all the other oppressive dictators we were supporting around the world. That if you get overthrown, we're just going to hand you back to the mobs. So, in terms of the Cold War, we felt like we had to not hand him over, but it led to this massive standoff. And every day on the news, the Iranians were often weekly on the news. The Iranians would trot out these hostages and interrogate them and film them. And so these images of Americans being held hostage in Iran were being broadcast around the world, showing America's continuing weakness and impotence in the face of foreign policy challenges. So, the Carter administration attempted a rescue, but a sandstorm in the desert led to the two helicopters crashing. And just like everything else, Jimmy Carter's presidency doesn't exactly go the way anyone. So we're going to end kind of on a low point here at the end of Unit 8, 1979, moving into 1980. The U.S. economy is a disaster. Faith in our institutions has reached a possibly all time low. Foreign policy wise, the Soviets are expanding, and the United States is looking incredibly weak on the world stage. And so clearly, some type of turnaround is needed for the election of 1980. And we'll leave you with a cliffhanger there and pick up with this after the AP test/final.